Hi there, Sacha Molitorisz here from UTS Law and the Centre for Media Transition. I'm on Gadigal land. Welcome to our annual Year in Media Transition. So in November 2025, that's this year, the CMT released its latest report. That's this one. I prepared that earlier. Gen AI and Journalism Towards Common Principles. It found an incremental increase in AI use in Australian newsrooms, no explosive uptake. As the report noted, Australian newsrooms are most comfortable using AI to augment rather than automate production, and the majority of experimentation is still occurring in the back end rather than audience-facing uses. So the report found Australia is not adopting new tech as fast as some other countries, and that, quote, experimentation is outpacing implementation. So Gen AI, right? It's this hot topic, and the collision of Gen AI and journalism has led to a lot of speculation, a lot of hyperbole, and a lot of hallucinations, of course. In this edition of this chat that we have annually, the Year in Media Transition, we'll talk about Gen AI and journalism with a focus on ethics. Gen AI, journalism, ethics. What an unholy threesome. Our guests are Sashka, Koloff, and Joe Hildebrand, both very experienced, wonderful journalists with expertise in this area. So Sashka, a Walkley Award-winning journalist, investigative storyteller, editorial leader, now standards editor at the ABC, the executive manager of Media Watch, and guiding the ABC's ethical approach to AI. And we have Joe, a journalist, television, radio presenter. You write for Sydney's Daily Telegraph, among other publications. You've won the Human Rights Print Media Award, and you've made a bunch of TV shows, including the ABC TV's Dumb, Drunk and Racist, among many other things. So welcome. It's great to have you here. Thank you. First, Sashka, I'll start with you. How have you seen and observed the journalists around you using AI?
Well, there's a lot more, it's right what your research showed that there's been a sort of a slow uptake here in Australia, a cautious approach. At the ABC, I'd say that's also true. Certainly, that the pace is picking up. There's a lot more ambition, a lot more desire for the ABC, particularly for journalists to move more quickly towards using AI for all sorts of things. There is still a reticence to publish content that's facing created by generative AI, but certainly in the journalistic effort for researching big data sets. We've used AI for years, really, to be fair, for things like transcription. There's opportunity for translations as well that the ABC is interrogating at the moment. Certainly the ABC has done some pretty interesting work creating its own tool, sort of a ring-fenced research tool called ABC Assist. So it has at the moment about 15 years worth of ABC content, video content, print stories, radio stories that are sort of ring-fenced. So it's used internally as a research tool to research some of the content that we've previously produced to help inform some of the reporting we're intending to do. It's also a super handy resource to find video archive that exists within the ABC. So that has been underway, that project, for about a year, and it's ever extending, expanding and growing. I also work in the screen division at the ABC. So it's different to news that we make documentaries, dramas, all the kids programming, things like that. There is, I think, a difference between sort of factual news stuff that is pertaining to be real and then some of the other sort of content that the ABC commissions in terms of the appetite to move more firmly towards using generative AI for all sorts of things. So I look at a lot of proposals coming in from external productions, producers wanting to use AI to change voices in VO, to use for animation, to do recreations, to synthesize the voice of a deceased person in a proposed documentary film. So more and more use cases really coming in, but we're still grappling with, the ABC at least, we're grappling with where are our red lines, where are our boundaries? What do we need to tell the audience if we're using generative AI for audience-facing content? When and where should those labels or disclaimers be? What is appropriate and what won't ultimately diminish public trust?
So really easy issues and questions you're dealing with, it sounds like.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, absolutely.
right. Joe, how about you? I mean, you work in several different areas of the media. What have you observed about journalists using AI?
Look, I'm very much a Luddite when it comes to AI. I use it for myself. I use it for transcribing, which I have to say is a godsend.
Mm.
I'm a very sort of AI skeptic, and then of course when I realised it could save me hours of having to type out, long-winded questions that I ask and having to listen to the sound of my own voice, I suddenly became an absolute acolyte. So that is fantastic. We use it, and as with that, I suppose, very basic example, but at news, it's used by others as basically as a time saver, so that you are, as Sashka said, not as a replacement for journalism, but really as a replacement for all those boring things that journalists have to do that isn't really journalism but sort of supports it. So I know there are people who use it for research purposes, to be able to really quickly get across a brief or a story if they're on their way to a presser or whatever. I don't think we do use it really for any, like, it's not replacing people in terms of writing stories or whatever. Inevitably, I think that will happen. AI will write, sport reports or match reports or even court reports, things that have pretty obvious parameters and have to follow pretty basic rules. But I don't think it will. I don't think it will ever, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later on. But I think the big question, you can't really talk about AI in journalism without just talking about AI full stop, and just where does it end? Where does it stop? What are its limits? Can it fully replicate a human experience or a human to human experience? At what point do people, can or will people be satisfied with interacting with AI in the same way as they are interacting with another human? And I'm sure we'll get onto that later. And I've got some pretty sort of meta views on that. But I think we have to always kind of be mindful of that as we use it in the sort of, the micro kind of, day-to-day incremental sphere, because I think you have to know the sort of potential destination of where you're going. You can sort of just take one step at a time and think, oh, well, it's just one step. But if you're walking towards the edge of a cliff, then you want to know where you're going.
You might not be stepping in the right direction.
That's right.
Yeah. So Sashka was describing this ring-fenced version of AI. I work here at UTS Law, and I know a lot of law firms are keen to embrace AI, but they're very skeptical and scared as well.
Yeah, well, I think lawyers are going to be among the first to go, so they should be scared.
Well, possibly there's some really interesting figures coming out that junior lawyers are being hired at unprecedented rates, partly to check AI outputs.
Right.
So there are some really interesting developments. But I understand, just like at the ABC, News Corp also has its internal version of AI, and this is something that's happening at legal firms where they're cautious. So what they're doing is, the big companies, they're building their own models where they're using their internal information, their data, their confidential information that will never be shared outside the company. So it works for the company. I've also spoken to people at News Corp. One senior person who just told me, look, I'm just not going to use the News Corp internal model. I don't know if you've had an experience with that, or if you have, you've seen your colleagues use it, or you've got any thoughts?
I only use AI for the most rudimentary, basic things. I don't use it to help me draft things. But everything that News Corp puts out, again, like you said, does have to be checked by a person before it goes public anyway, which again, I suppose becomes almost a bit of a tautology, doesn't it? You use AI to replace what a person does, but then you have to hire a person to check that the AI is right. And yeah, so it is there, and again, it's there to sort of, whip up information. For example, one colleague gets AI to put together, to create a podcast and then he listens to the podcast while he's driving to a story. So that he's, and I think it was a podcast about, the latest, motoring offering he was going to. So he said, well, what's the background of this car manufacturer, this brand, this model, this new technology they're using. And so when he arrives, he's all up to it. So that's all generated by AI. And again, this is someone who's an expert in this field. So presumably anything that it threw up that was wrong or sounded sus, he'd be better placed to most than identify. But I suppose you don't have to. But again, that comes out in the wash anyway, because that's just to inform interactions he has at a presser with a person who is actually, knowing all that stuff. So, there's an inbuilt, buffer, if you like, or ring fence or whatever, where the stuff that AI has generated is going to him. So that's one sort of internal vetting process. And then it's being used for him to actually do his job in talking to, the CEO of a car company or whatever. And then what's coming out of that is sort of entirely human generated, even though it has an AI input.
So Sashka, you spent quite a bit of time recently in Oxford, which might have been a pilgrimage to see the roots of Radiohead. I'm not sure. We haven't talked about this. But I gather you also did a lot of work with the Reuters Institute, which is, one of the global hotspots for journalistic research. There's so much great work coming out of there. And that's what you were doing there, some research into Gen AI and journalism. So tell us what some of your findings were.
Yeah, well, I had the great fortune of being a fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism for a few months earlier this year, where, with a group of other journalists from around the world, but also writing a paper. And the focus of my paper was about journalism's role in an AI-driven world. So it had two components to it, really, looking at trust and the causes of the decline in trust in news media, and really I guess the challenges and opportunities that generative AI presents in an already fragile trust environment. And I guess if I could sort of distill it down, what I sort of walked away with really is it's kind of like a rallying call for all of us to really try and think about what is journalism's unique role in this information environment where AI can remix your content. It could create from an article a podcast that sounds completely human. It can do all sorts of things, obviously, as we know. But what then is the role of journalism in what is such a disintermediated news and information environment? And for many of the publishers I spoke to, like the Reuters news agency, I spoke to the New York Times, etc., it's really about really getting clear about what we do that AI mimics but could never actually do. And a lot of thinking is going into sort of, boots on the ground. So automating those tasks that take a lot of time but don't really value add much, so that we can put more journos back into the field. I mean, that's the great idea. As to how it will work in practice, who the hell knows? But certainly there were some key kind of takeaways when I spoke to news organizations around the world as to how they're building their newsrooms of the future and identifying some key priorities. I mean, one thing I would say is that, we can't treat generative AI as optional anymore. It is certainly reshaping how the public interacts with information. So the notion that we can ignore it, not engage with it is gone. That's totally impossible at this point. Two things that I'd probably really, and I have been sort of discussing with my colleagues, is to what we need to be doing now in this environment is doubling down on AI literacy. Some really interesting conversations there with someone from Harvard who sort of does a straw poll every time she speaks about AI, and she speaks a lot around the world. She often asks for a show of hands of how many people are using generative AI in their work in a room of journos. She says it's around 40%. So there's a real divide, a generational divide, a professional divide. So I would suggest that what we need to do is really focus on double down on AI literacy. And if we're, developing new tools or rolling out new tools, we have to train our people in the responsible use of these tools as we're rolling them out. And the other thing that I found really interesting is, you know, the notion of establishing what are your red lines, what are your no-go areas. For the Reuters news agency, for example, they will not use generative AI when it comes to images. No generative AI with images. That's their stock and trade. That it has to be real. They're a news agency selling that around the world. So they will not manipulate real, true content, really, images and videos. So interesting, I think, for us to be thinking about how can we build our AI literacy and then also where are our red lines, and they may change as public expectation changes. So this is what I think we're grappling with very much at the moment, particularly at the ABC where I work and with the people that I'm working with in Screen Division as well.
Fantastic. Look, it sounds, you mentioned the word opportunity quite a lot, also the word challenge, but clearly there's optimism might be taking it too far, but you certainly see opportunities and possibilities there, right? And you say it can't be ignored. We can't ignore it. Joe, on the other hand, you sound more skeptical about Gen AI. I mean, transcription is something that you mentioned, and I'm with you there.
I'm very happy with that.
I'm very happy with transcription as well. That's that as an ex-print journalist, that would take so much time, and it wasn't productive time, right? You think it might be productive time, but it actually wasn't. It was just a very time-consuming, painful exercise. Right. So the AI really helps with that. But I want to take you to something very specific that Sashka said, Joe, and that is that question of trust. This is a hard question, but trust is so important to journalists, and unfortunately, it's not in a good place. The research keeps showing that there's a problem with trust. Is that a big issue for you? And the potential, the connection there between Gen AI and trust?
Yes, absolutely. Even before AI came along, I think the collapse in trust in public institutions like the media, like the parliament, like major parties, like democracy itself. There's constantly polls showing a collapse in democracy being seen as the best form of government, particularly among young people. And we all know what the alternative is. But again, these are people who weren't born before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so they think, oh, that looks great. I've just learned about this new thing called Marxism. It sounds fantastic. So I'm more concerned about that than anything else in the world. And AI obviously contributes to that. I think Sashka's absolutely correct that we cannot ignore it. This is something that is happening. I'm always reminded of that great scene in True Romance with James Gandolfini, who was a hitman who was about to kill a gutsy young woman who's fighting him off, and he says, "This is happening. This is happening. Don't do that." As it turns out, she lived. So,
spoiler alert.
So that's what I cling to for with both my skeptical fatalism and boundless hope and optimism. So I think that the most important thing is, firstly, if you talk about fate, so what's happened is that, as Sasha would well know, with the complete fragmentation of media, there is no kind of ambient exposure to contrary views if you don't want them. So it's a bit like a pandemic hitting you and no one has immunity because no one's been exposed to any germs or any other diseases before, right? So if you now have the capacity to do a deep dive into any issue that you are particularly obsessed about and find a wealth of information that will completely reinforce and support your pre-existing biases, your pre-existing complete and utter conspiracy theories, like simply non-factual. I mean, this is why we have a new generation of anti-vaxxers. But at the same time, and again, they don't have a monopoly on nut jobs. We saw plenty of sort of hysteria in the other direction as well, and we've seen the catastrophic impact that overzealousness fueled by sort of, I hate the term virtue signaling, but people basically shaming anyone who didn't sort of go with the status quo has resulted in horrendous economic consequences, horrendous outcomes for school kids. Again, and that's just during the pandemic, and that's before AI really came along. So that will mean that it will end up becoming like things like, banking scams, Nigerian lottery scams, where the best defense is going to be people being skeptical, like me, hopefully, and literate about it and knowing when to spot one. And I was on a bus recently. There were two teenage girls sitting behind me, and they're both looking at something on their mobile phone. Blah, 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 blah. I have no idea what it is. It's completely different language. But one says, "Oh no, it's AI." She goes, "Oh really? I thought it was real. Oh well." And immediately they just didn't give a fuck about it at all anymore. Just simply ceased to matter. And I think that will be our great defense. So there will be, to put it in as a marketer would, there'll be a premium on human to human content. And so when people, there's two questions. One is, can AI replicate the human experience? So yes, it can write a court report or a match report or whatever. That's pretty basic stuff. And I've always said that journalism is more of a trade than a profession or a craft anyway. I think sometimes we can get too many tickets on ourselves. But will it be able to replicate, those big emotional connections that people have with journos, such as, incredibly, voice of reason columnist like myself, or an Annabelle Crabb who lives over the road from me. I can see her house from here, or Andrew Bolt, or whoever it may be. Will it be able to replicate, a piece of writing that has that much power, or, incredibly moving feature on, a family who's lost their daughter to suicide, or, which is worth mentioning given the social media ban coming in this week, So question one, can AI do that? I'm not saying it can't, but I don't think we've seen it yet. It still, to me, tastes a little bit like NutraSweet. It's, it's a bit like sugar, but you can tell the difference and it's not quite as satisfying. And then the second question is, what happens, like the two girls sitting on the bus behind me, when people find out? And people says, "Oh, you know that guy who you thought you'd been really connecting with and who'd been revving you up about whatever it was. It's just a robot." That makes you, I think, that devalues your experience. So suddenly you're not, connecting with someone, not part of a bigger movement, or in fact, you're a sap. You've been hacked. Robot has tricked you into feeling something, and tricked you into
but I mean,
empathizing with them when they're not really there. And I think that takes it away. And it's kind of like, I think even when we have sex robots, I don't think that's going to replace people wanting to have actual relationships. Even if that robot can do every single thing that a human being can, I think we'll still want to have. And I think there is a fundamental need for human to human connection, and that even if people think they are getting it, when they find out that they're not, there will be a revolt against that, as there has been a revolt against social media and this week.
I'm not sure I agree with you. I'm not sure if that's right. That people are going to swing back to yourself or Annabelle Crabb, etc. I mean, what is actually happening, what we see now, absolutely, is that, we're living in what is called, an environment of disintermediation, right? So there is a barrier, and AI is now going to further and further and further control the information flow. People are already going to ChatGPT to drive every aspect of their life, to answer every question for them, to decide what they're going to do for any kind of piece of information. I think it's we can hope that maybe there'll be a retreat to people like yourself or to some of our colleagues at the ABC.
They're not going to rely on me for directions.
For someone who they like or trust, or what they offer. But I'm not so sure. I think that there's a lot of organisations that are hoping for that will happen, but it's unclear whether that will actually ring true in the end, or whether it's just going to be further and further away from us in terms of our control. So, but it does sort of come back to the idea of what is the unique value that we offer, what is the point of difference in an environment where literally nobody trusts anything anymore. Because the information environment is so polluted, is so fragmented. People don't trust things that don't align with their worldview. The research shows that very clearly, as you point out, Joe. But we are sort of moving towards an information environment where nothing is trusted, nothing at all.
That's Really interesting. Look, I thought it took far too long in this conversation to hear the phrase sex robots, so I'm glad we got there. I love the image, Joe, of you living across the road from Annabelle Crabb, and I just picture you writing a column and then Annabelle responding with a column, and like a game of column tennis or something. But also, Joe, I think you almost said something nice about the ABC, which I'm not sure you're allowed to do when you're talking about objectivity and impartiality. You almost showed some sympathy there. So I just needed to. I just needed to call you up on that. Look, there is so much to talk about here, and you both covered so many huge, fascinating issues that we could delve into. But I want to move on to one other specific thing, and that is, one of the problems, and it ties into this trust issue that we've been talking about, is money, right? That the financial model of the news media has just been ripped out from under it over the past few years, by digital technology, basically, right? So. And there's this issue where AI in particular is using all this news content to train itself, to train its outputs, right? Not to train itself, that implies agency, by companies such as OpenAI to use, they use news content in order to create outputs that people want to read, right? So news companies, in the face of that, they've had different strategies. There are basically two: make a deal. Take money that AI companies might offer you, or sue them, right? And so we've seen both. There's been a great new tracker of these deals and disputes that was launched last week by, just looking back at my notes here, the Tao Centre for Journalism. So, last month, Meta said it had struck several commercial AI data agreements with news publishers, including USA Today, People Inc., CNN, and the list goes on. There's this tension here. There's a lot going on. What do you think is fair? What is the right way to go here? News companies are kind of in a bind. It's like, we really need money. We should get money, but are we selling our souls? Joe, what do you think here?
Again, I think it is inevitable that this is just going to happen, and either it's going to happen with people just doing it anyway. And I mean, again, the question is not sort of what should we do, it's almost what can we do. I mean, it's going to happen. I think we need to chase every dollar we possibly can. And again, we've managed to do that for a limited time with social media companies using news content and making money off it. They've obviously decided, to say F you now. And the question will be, how can that be regulated? Can and will US regulators play ball and support, the efforts of smaller companies in smaller nations? The other question is, how much, I think sooner or later, is Facebook prepared to just sort of trash its reputation? Does it care? Maybe not, but it still pretends that it's, meant to be a good corporate citizen. And so, the question is whether or not these brands actually value themselves and if they want to be seen to be good corporate citizens. There is, I'm not, I know I was meant to be this.
It's very optimistic.
I know that somehow I'm turning into the optimistic way. I'm not optimistic at all, but I think it's certainly worth pursuing.
Sashka, you're at the ABC where it's different, right? So you're a public broadcaster. You are funded by the federal government, but you still got some money under the News Media Bargaining Code from the social media platforms and the search, basically from Meta and from Google, as Joe said. That's currently being revised and will hopefully, fingers crossed, is my perspective, will be resuscitated in the form of the News Media Initiative, which will be decided next year. So money might start to begin to flow again. What's your view on this particular issue about money from Gen AI?
I think that it's a live debate at the ABC, like it is everywhere. Certainly, a lot of big news organisations around the world have signed deals. The New York Times took OpenAI to court, but it's also signed a separate deal now with Amazon, I believe. The Atlantic magazine, you'll probably remember, early on signed with OpenAI with the idea is like, let's get compensation for our content, and then let's be at the table to try and drive the conversation and influence the decisions being made. So I can see that rationale and reasoning, and perhaps, as Joe perhaps alluded to, that it might be inevitable. The question though becomes this. You could see it in the frame of a licensing deal, right? You're licensing your content for an AI company to learn from, right? So once you've done that deal, it's a one-off deal. What's the appropriate price for the content? For little guys, smaller publishers, they may sell their content or license their content for an AI model to train on, but it will be a one-off deal. There won't be continuing revenue. There won't be an ongoing revenue stream for that. I think it's basically, here's the price that we're going to license our content to this company for their models to train on. So I think that's the question, what's the reasonable amount of money, and remembering that it may just be a one-off licensing deal, a one-off deal. So there's not going to be a longevity to that. It's not going to be a replacement really as a commercial income stream. It will probably be a one-off deal for a certain amount of money. So how much do you charge? I think that's a big question that is probably being debated. What do you do if you're a little publisher? Because there's not going to be a guaranteed income stream. You're going to be selling off your content to then actually write yourself out of the industry altogether. When you also suggested that AI doesn't learn off itself, I gather that it is. I think some, in a discussion with an AI expert just yesterday, suggested that now AIs are actually training off themselves. So these are going to be small deals, really, these publishing deals. As we know, AI companies have done deals with all sorts of organizations, universities, law firms. So, it may be exhausted at a certain point where the AI is just learning from itself ultimately, or training on its own data.
Yeah, fascinating. I guess that brings us to the issue of hallucinations in a way, right? And that word really bothers me. It's like a Silicon Valley tech bro who's trying something with peyote at Burning Man. There's this kind of innocence in a way to the word, and experimentation where really it's problematic. We're talking about falsehoods, right? And falsehood it's kryptonite for journalists, right? Journalists, we trade in accuracy and truth telling, right? So facts. One example from recent weeks that you may remember is when a Sydney Morning Herald designer was named as someone suspected of historical murder. And that designer was named in this AI output merely because his name appeared on the graphic design, the illustration that accompanied the story. Okay, so do we need to worry about these hallucinations? I guess, you've touched on this to some extent, but focusing specifically on this. So how do we reconcile AI that's meant to be helpful rather than necessarily accurate, which we know it usually is, with journalism, which has a different set of values? Sashka, how do you respond?
Well, I mean, it's not the tool, but how we use it, right? So one thing that, obviously AI brings with it a unique set of challenges, but one thing, as I'm going to paraphrase Jeff Beckett from the London School of Economics, who points out that AI actually makes you lazy, right? So I think news organizations have to be really thoughtful about how they use these tools. We've seen multiple examples of errors creeping in. Bloomberg News, financial news outfit from the US, using AI to create or generate summaries now of their financial news. Multiple errors as reported by the New York Times. NPR broke a story with summer book reading list that was published in multiple American newspapers a few months ago, littered again with errors. The freelancer who was supposed to write those book reviews had used generative AI to do that work instead, littered with errors. Okay, so it's not the tool, but the use of the tool. So I think we have to be...
It's the tool using the tool.
Yeah, that's exactly. Okay, so we know that it makes mistakes. We know that it hallucinates. We know that there are inherent biases, right? So as to who has programmed the tools, in the case of Elon Musk's Grok, we know that the tool was, there were particular, biases written into the algorithm. We go in mindfully knowing that. So, don't use AI for silly things. Make sure you check your work. Know that silly uses of AI tools can actually diminish trust. So be mindful of that. I think that's the messaging there. It's not particularly the tool itself, although we know where it falls down, but think about the use case.
Yeah, yeah. Joe, how do you see that tension between journalism, which needs to value accuracy above all else, and Gen AI, which doesn't?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think it's good. I think it's good that AI gets things wrong, and starkly so, because I think that will continue the skepticism with which it is viewed, and make sure that people do not just see it as a substitute for. I mean, humans can get things wrong as well. Let's not forget, and deliberately so
Yeah.
sometimes. But again, I think it's when AI gets everything right, and we can debate what that means in a post-truth world. But it's when AI gets everything right that I think we really need to worry, because, of course, that will be when people do see it as a replacement for a human role, and that will be when, if it does get something wrong, and I can think of countless scenarios in which AI could have a catastrophic impact, then everyone will believe it. Another interesting thing is. I do lots of cryptic crosswords, and often you have to sort of Google something. Is this a word that means this that you haven't heard of? Blah 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 blah. AI is no use whatsoever. It's completely impossible, because, of course, AI is programmed to give you the most likely
Yeah.
result. It is antithetical to it to think laterally or counterintuitively, which, of course, is part of the whole joy of doing a cryptic crossword, by sort of saying, right, what if this means, the opposite of what I'm assuming it is? Now, I mean, that's a ridiculously sort of esoteric example, but that sort of the pleasure of doing that, which human beings have been doing for a couple of hundred years, AI can never ever replicate that, and it is absolutely no good. So, in terms of thinking outside the box, thinking laterally, being that sort of 10th man, saying, what if everybody else is wrong and this is right? Those sorts of things I don't think AI will be able to do, or at least, and again,
We'll wait and see.
or maybe it will be when someone says, actually, AI, can you please do this?
Yeah.
Again, it would still require a human to tell it to do that. And if, like Sashka is saying, if AI is just harvesting stuff based on what's on the internet, so it's not harvesting data from the actual real world, can it write a poem about a tree, maybe, but can it smell a tree, maybe one day it will be able to replicate that.
And certainly, the experts I spoke to make the point that there is an obvious commercial imperative for the accuracy to improve, and it is. So, I think we can expect that, the hallucinations issue will be remedied at a certain point. And I'd also sort of make the point that I think that the scope of what is training these models far surpasses Twitter, or what, the online conversation is. It's beyond probably our imagination, what is now being used to train these models. The sad thing is we have no transparency over that, do we?
In terms of ethics, there are a lot of issues here, right? Hallucinations are just one of them. There are lots of specific journalism ethics questions, and I'll come back to that in a second. But there's these other ones that don't seem to be talked about as much as they should, I think. These issues we have been talking about, they're just the tip of the ethical iceberg, if you will. The environment, right? That's a really big one. Just the environmental impacts of all these AI outputs, all the data centers that are being built, more and more. The UN has weighed in on that. Bias is another one, right? That these outputs are not neutral, right? The data that is being used to train the AI, there's usually bias there, depending on where the data set comes from. Privacy, all sorts of privacy issues arise. Sashka, do you think we're talking about these issues enough, or are we right? Are we getting it right?
I don't think we're talking about it enough in terms of the environmental impact, particularly. It is there. We kind of know about it, but it doesn't seem to be influencing people's, desire to use these tools in their daily lives. As we know, the uptake of ChatGPT, for example, I think, back earlier this year in April, it was 1 billion daily interactions. That's months ago. That will be dwarfed now. The uptake of licenses, commercial people paying licenses or buying the product far dwarfs the rate of news subscriptions, for example. So I don't think that these conversations are around the environmental impact really hitting the consumer at this moment. So we'll see where it lands. Certainly, countries like Australia and others seeing an opportunity for us to be, building more data centres. The commercial opportunity for Australia to be a space to play in that area. So, yeah, I don't think the conversation is really resonating at the moment, particularly around the environmental impact.
Yeah, I mean, as the UN wrote recently, there's these large amounts of water that are being consumed, and water's becoming scarce in many places.
Yes.
They rely on critical minerals, rare elements. They're often mined unsustainably, and they use massive amounts of electricity, of course. I don't know, Joe, have you got any thoughts on these attendant ethical issues, these larger ones?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not expert on the environmental stuff at all, but in terms of bias, again, this is, of course, these machines are going to reflect the bias of whoever programs them, whoever puts in the inputs, sets the parameters for what they want it to learn and to produce, and it will reflect the bias of everything it harvests online.
What sort of laws do we need? Are there a couple of things that you think we do need? And to tie into that, is there a role for journalism standards, for the codes and standards that journalists work by? Yeah. So what are those legal and regulatory settings? Do you have hope for them? And there are a couple of things that you think would help.
Yeah, well,
Sashka?
it was interesting, to see the failure of the disinformation bill that was attempted last year, around this time last year. So that, I thought that was a good idea. As to the execution, there's obviously a policy, there's some tension there and a sort of a policy failing. But I believe that we need regulation. I think that there should be regulation as well as to, how we, for AI at the moment. At the moment, it's a bit of a hands-off approach by the productivity commissioners stepping in to sort of steer that discussion and debate in Australia. A bit of a hands-off approach. I think there was a bit of a win for creators' rights in terms of, not allowing AI to be able to train off creators' IP. That was useful, but much, much more could be done in the regulatory space, I believe, and we've still got to grapple with that. I think there's also a huge role that we need to be playing, the ABC, other media organisations, but also the federal government in building media literacy. So we know that they've committed some money towards building a media literacy strategy. That is very slow. I think the discussion and the debate is all focused on the social media ban, but meanwhile, that is languishing. So more and more needs to be done in that space. So yeah, I think we're only at the start of this. We've seen the EU AI Act. That's a good, really valuable piece of work. We've seen in the UK efforts really on a policy framework to build media strategy, media literacy, a strategy around that. And I think in Australia, we're just too slow, but much, much more needs to be done there.
Joe, do you think the law and regulation has a role to play in improving journalism standards, specifically with regard to Gen AI and even to boxing in Gen AI generally?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we need to sort of, regulate the limits of AI, but again, we can pass a law, but whether we actually do it, I mean, the law always runs behind technological innovation. I'm very, very skeptical, and I think the fate of the government's misinformation bill speaks for itself. It's all well and good, in theory to say, of course, people should not be allowed to spread dangerous misinformation, but then, of course, deciding what's misinformation or what's just an opinion, what's dangerous or what's not. And again, so I think it's much more important. And again, you can do that. You can ban 9 things that are, absolutely pathologically untrue, and one thing that actually turns out to be true, and suddenly you've undermined your whole, suddenly no one believes, and people say, oh, well, it must all be true.
It's getting to predictions, and we've really talked about this already, but I guess predictions about AI journalism and ethics. Maybe is there anything you wanted to add to what you've already said, or something that you wanted to sum up? Yeah, what do you think about the future in regards to AI journalism and ethics, Joe?
I will just say quickly that I think it is going to be okay, because the alternative is unthinkable.
Well said. Sashka?
I think that the journalism standards and ethics remain as they've always remained. I don't think anything's going to change there. To be fair, I think audiences will become more and more comfortable, actually, with what they see. If it's been, for example, in the screen area, there's a lot of ideas to replace humans with AI recreations in films and documentaries. I think will be led by audience appetite. As that shifts, as AI becomes more ubiquitous, will there be a return to trusted source of news like the ABC or News Corp? Well, we'll have to wait and see. I don't know what the answer is to that.
Wait and see. Wait and see. Well, we've covered metaphysical issues, sex robots. We've talked about challenges, opportunities. Joe, Sashka, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll hopefully do it again soon.
Thanks so much. Great pleasure.